My name is Alex, and a single decision changed my life forever. One night, while struggling to make ends meet in the city that never sleeps, I met someone who offered me an opportunity I couldn't refuse. Richard. A millionaire old enough to be my father, with eyes that saw through every wall I'd built around myself. It started with money, just one night to help him feel alive again. But I didn't expect how it would leave me questioning everything. Who was he really? And why did I feel like I was the one being saved? This is the story of how I discovered the price of love and myself in the most unexpected place. It was a night like any other. Or so I thought. The streets of New York hummed with life. Neon lights reflecting off rain-soaked pavement as I walked back from my third shift of the day. My feet ached, my head throbbed, and my wallet was emptier than I cared to admit. As I passed a quiet, upscale bar, I caught a glimpse of him sitting in the corner, alone but exuding a presence that demanded attention. He was a man you couldn't ignore. Looked to be in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with silver hair combed perfectly back and an impeccable black suit that screamed money. But it was his eyes that froze me in place. Piercing, observant, and somehow familiar. Before I could look away, he motioned for me to come inside. My first instinct was to keep walking. I wasn't the type to get involved with strangers, let alone ones who radiated power like that. But something about him was magnetic. I stepped inside, the warmth of the bar wrapping around me as soft jazz played in the background. I approached cautiously, unsure of what to expect. "You seem like you could use a drink," he said, his voice smooth and measured. I hesitated but nodded, taking the seat across from him. "I'm Richard," he introduced himself, extending a hand. His grip was firm but not overbearing. "Alex," I replied, trying to steady my voice. I couldn't help but feel out of place in my worn jacket and scuffed boots. The conversation started innocently enough. He asked about my work, my life, the kind of questions that made me feel exposed but oddly seen. There was no judgment in his tone, just curiosity. I told him about my dead-end jobs, my dreams that felt farther away with each passing day, and the crushing weight of trying to survive in a city that chews you up and spits you out. Then he leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "What if I told you I could take care of all of that? Your debts, your worries, everything, for one night?" My stomach flipped, and I wasn't sure if it was from shock or intrigue. "One night?" I repeated, my voice barely audible. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Spend the night with me. No strains, no expectations. I'll pay you enough to turn your life around." I wanted to laugh, to dismiss him as just another rich man trying to buy his way out of loneliness. But the look in his eyes stopped me. It wasn't lust or arrogance. It was vulnerability, a crack in the armor of a man who seemed untouchable. "Why me?" I blurted out, unable to contain my disbelief. Richard smiled faintly. "Because you remind me of something I lost a long time ago." The weight of his words hung between us, heavy and unsettling. I could feel the temptation clawing at the edges of my resolve. The idea of financial freedom was intoxicating, but it wasn't just the money that made me consider his offer. It was the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world who could fill the void he was carrying. After what felt like an eternity, I found myself nodding. "Okay," I said, my voice trembling, "but I don't want to regret this." Richard's expression softened, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Neither do I," he replied. That night, as I walked beside him toward his car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into something far more complicated than I could imagine. And yet, I couldn't stop myself. What was it about him that made me want to stay? Was it the promise of stability? Or was it something deeper? Something I wasn't ready to admit? Richard's car was exactly what I'd expected: sleek, black, and expensive enough to pay my rent for a year. The leather seats felt foreign under me, their softness a stark contrast to the worn-out bus seats I was used to. The silence between us during the drive wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, as if we both knew the weight of the unspoken agreement hanging in the air. My heart raced with every turn, my mind flooded with questions I wasn't ready to ask. We pulled up to a building that looked more like a modern-day palace than a home. Glass walls reflected the city lights, and the doorman greeted Richard with a nod that spoke of years of familiarity. I followed him into the elevator, feeling like an intruder in a world I didn't belong to. The ride up was quiet, the hum of the elevator the only sound between us. My stomach churned as I replayed his words from the bar. You remind me of something I lost. What did that mean? The doors opened to a penthouse that could only be described as breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering skyline, and minimalist furniture filled the space with an understated elegance. Everything about it screamed wealth. But it wasn't cold or ostentatious. It felt lived in. Richard gestured for me to sit on the plush white couch. And I hesitated, afraid of leaving a mark on something so pristine. Make yourself comfortable, he said, his voice soft but commanding. I sat down, my hands gripping my knees as I tried to steady my breathing. Richard disappeared into another room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. What was I doing here? Was I really about to go through with this? The thought of walking away crossed my mind. But before I could act on it, Richard returned, carrying 2 glasses of wine. He handed me one and sat down across from me. His posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. So, he began, swirling the wine in his glass. Tell me what you're thinking. His directness caught me off guard. But I appreciated it. I took a sip of the wine. Its richness unfamiliar but soothing. I don't know where to start. I admitted, this isn't exactly a normal situation for me. Richard chuckled, the sound warm and disarming. It's not normal for me either. If that helps. I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. Really? Because you seem pretty comfortable. He leaned back, his gaze never leaving mine. Comfortable, maybe, but not immune. His words were cryptic, and I couldn't tell if he was being vulnerable or evasive. Either way, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. There was something about the way he carried himself, confident yet unguarded, that made me want to know more. As the night went on, our conversation shifted. We talked about our lives, our pasts, and the choices that had led us to that moment. Richard shared stories of his younger days, of building his empire from nothing, and of the sacrifices he'd made along the way. You lose parts of yourself, he said quietly, staring into his glass. You don't even notice it until it's too late. His honesty surprised me. I'd expected him to be distant, maybe even cold, but instead, he was laying himself bare in a way that felt almost intimate. And that scared me. This was supposed to be transactional, simple, but the more he spoke, the more I realized that this wasn't just about money for him. It was about connection, about filling a void that even all his wealth couldn't touch. At one point, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was fleeting but electric, sending a shiver down my spine. I looked up, meeting his eyes, and for a moment, the world around us disappeared. There was no penthouse, no contract, no agreement, just 2 people, raw and exposed. But then the moment passed, and reality came crashing back. I pulled my hand away, breaking the spell. I should probably go, I said, my voice barely steady. Richard's expression faltered, but he nodded. Is that what you want? His tone was even, but there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. I stood, my legs feeling like they might give out beneath me. As I turned to leave, his voice stopped me. Alex. I froze, my heart pounding. You don't have to decide tonight. Just think about it. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and walked out the door. In the elevator, I leaned against the wall, my mind racing. I thought this would be simple. Just one night, one decision, but Richard had turned my world upside down, and I wasn't sure I could ever go back to the way things were. The next morning, I woke up feeling like the ground beneath me had shifted. The events of the previous night played on a loop in my head. Richard's words, his gaze, the way his hand had lingered against mine. I wanted to chalk it all up to a strange, one-time encounter, but it wasn't that simple. Something about him had gotten under my skin, and the more I tried to shake it, the more deeply it seemed to settle. I spent the day distracted, going through the motions of work while my mind wandered back to him. By the time my shift ended, I found myself staring at my phone, his number saved in my contacts as if it had always been there. I wanted to call, to hear his voice, but what would I even say? That I couldn't stop thinking about him, that I didn't know how to handle the way he made me feel. It wasn't just the offer that haunted me. It was him. I was still debating when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number lit up the screen, but I didn't need to guess who it was. Dinner tonight? No expectations, just company. My stomach flipped, and before I could talk myself out of it, I typed back a single word, okay. When I arrived at the restaurant, Richard was already there, seated at a corner table with a view of the city. He stood as I approached, his smile warm but hesitant, as if he wasn't sure I'd actually show up. "Alex," he greeted me, pulling out my chair. "I'm glad you came." I nodded, suddenly feeling self-conscious under his gaze. I wasn't sure I would. I admitted, but here I am. The evening started out awkwardly. Both of us skirting around the elephant in the room. He asked about my day, and I asked about his. Our conversation polite but superficial. It wasn't until the waiter brought the wine that the tension began to thaw. Richard raised his glass, his eyes meeting mine. "To second chances," he said, his tone soft but sincere. I clinked my glass against his, feeling a strange mix of nerves and comfort. As the night went on, our conversation deepened. He opened up about his life in ways I hadn't expected, sharing stories about his childhood, his struggles, and the loneliness that had followed him despite his success. "People think money fixes everything," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "But it just makes the emptiness louder." I listened, captivated by the vulnerability in his words. It was clear that beneath his polished exterior was a man who had spent years building walls to protect himself, only to realize that those same walls had trapped him inside. As I listened, I felt my own walls beginning to crack. For so long, I told myself that I didn't need anyone, that relying on others was a weakness. But Richard was making me question everything I thought I knew about myself. At one point, he reached across the table, his hand covering mine. This time, I didn't pull away. Instead, I looked up at him, my heart pounding as I searched his eyes for answers. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Richard's gaze softened, and he squeezed my hand gently. "Because you remind me of the person I used to be, before I lost myself." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to say something, to tell him that he wasn't as lost as he thought, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I let the silence speak for me. Our hands intertwined as the city lights twinkled behind him. By the time the check came, I felt like I'd been through an emotional whirlwind. Richard insisted on paying, and as we left the restaurant, he turned to me with a look of quiet determination. "Walk with me," he said, his voice low but steady. I nodded, falling into step beside him. As we wandered through the bustling streets, the city was alive around us. But all I could focus on was him, his presence, his warmth, the way he made me feel seen in a way no one else ever had. At one point, we stopped in front of a small park, the sound of laughter and distant traffic filling the air. Richard turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Alex," he began, his voice soft but firm. "I don't want to push you into anything you're not ready for. But I need you to know I want more than just one night." His words sent my heart racing, a mix of fear and hope coursing through me. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, a voice interrupted us. "Richard?" We both turned to see a man approaching, his expression one of confusion and surprise. Richard's face paled, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. The man who approached us was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with an air of authority. His sharp eyes darted between Richard and me. A mixture of curiosity and disbelief etched across his face. I felt the tension in Richard's posture as he stepped slightly in front of me, shielding me in a way that only heightened my unease. "Daniel," Richard said, his voice calm but clipped. "What are you doing here?" The name rang in the air like a challenge, one that neither man seemed eager to address outright. Daniel crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing as they settled on me. "I should be asking you the same thing. Who's this?" Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Daniel to pounce. "Don't tell me," he scoffed, his tone dripping with mockery. "Another one of your projects?" The implication in his words stung. Even though I barely knew the man, I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. But before I could react, Richard stepped in. "That's enough, Daniel," Richard said firmly, his voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. "Alex is not your concern." Daniel's expression darkened, and he took a step closer, his presence suddenly suffocating. "Not my concern?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You're unbelievable, Richard, throwing money around, trying to fix whatever hole you've dug yourself into again." "Daniel, stop," Richard snapped, his calm demeanor cracking. "You have no idea what you're talking about." The exchange was heated, personal, and full of history I wasn't privy to. It felt like I was watching a play where everyone knew their lines except me. But one thing was clear. Daniel's words had struck a nerve. I think I've got a pretty good idea. Daniel retorted, his gaze flicking back to me. You find someone vulnerable. Someone who doesn't know any better. And you, that's enough. Richard's voice cut through the air, loud and commanding. The sudden outburst startled both of us. And for a moment, silence reigned. Richard turned to me, his expression softening. Alex, I'm sorry you had to hear that. His voice was quiet now, laced with regret. I nodded, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to leave, to escape the drama I hadn't signed up for. But another part, a deeper, more stubborn part, wanted to stay. Richard had stood up for me, defended me in a way no one ever had, and I couldn't ignore the pull I felt toward him. Daniel shook his head, letting out a bitter laugh. You're always sorry, Richard. That's your problem, but sorry doesn't fix everything. With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving us standing there in the middle of the park, the weight of his words hanging between us. Richard let out a long breath, running a hand through his silver hair. I didn't want you to see that, he admitted, his voice low. Daniel and we have a complicated history. I didn't press for details, sensing that the wound was still raw. Instead, I reached out my hand, brushing against his. Are you okay? I asked, my voice soft. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sadness. I'll be fine, he said, though the strain in his voice told a different story. But this isn't how I wanted tonight to go. I gave him a small smile, trying to lighten the mood. Well, I guess it's not a proper night in New York without a little drama. Richard chuckled, the tension easing slightly. You're incredible. You know that? He said, his tone warm. I felt my cheeks flush. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that he might actually mean it. We walked back to his car in comfortable silence, the city buzzing around us as if nothing had happened. But inside, I was a storm of emotions. Daniel's words had stirred doubts I didn't want to face. Was I just another project to Richard? Another fleeting distraction in his life? Or was there something real between us? Something worth fighting for? As we reached his car, Richard turned to me, his expression earnest. Alex, he began, his voice steady. I know tonight was a lot. And I understand if you need time to process everything. But I want you to know that I'm here for you. Not because I pity you. Or because I need you to fix me. But because you're the first person in a long time who's made me feel alive again. His words hit me like a tidal wave, washing away some of the doubts that had taken root. But before I could respond, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, frowning as an unknown number flashed on the screen. Who is it? Richard asked, concern flickering in his eyes. I shook my head, unsure. I don't know, I admitted, but it's probably nothing. I was wrong. When I answered, the voice on the other end was frantic, almost incoherent. Alex, you need to come home now. It's about your brother. The voice on the other end of the phone belonged to my roommate, Josh, and his frantic tone sent chills through me. Alex, it's your brother. He's in the hospital. You need to come now, he said, his words tumbling over each other in a rush. My heart dropped. What happened? I asked, my voice rising with panic. But Josh couldn't give me much information. Just that there had been an accident. And I needed to get there immediately. Richard stood beside me, his face etched with concern as he watched me process the call. What's going on? He asked, his voice calm but urgent. My brother, I managed to say, the words catching in my throat. He's in the hospital. I need to go. Without hesitation, Richard pulled out his car keys. Let me drive you. I wanted to protest, to insist that I could handle it on my own. But there wasn't time to argue. I nodded, and we climbed into his car. The drive felt like it took an eternity. Even though Richard weaved through traffic with the precision of someone used to navigating the chaos of the city. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, my stomach twisting into knots as I imagined what could have happened to my younger brother. Ben, Richard's presence was a strange comfort. He didn't try to fill the silence with empty words. But every so often, he'd glance at me, his expression steady and reassuring. It was the kind of support I hadn't realized I needed. And in that moment, I was grateful for him in a way I couldn't yet articulate. When we arrived at the hospital, I barely waited for the car to stop before I jumped out and ran inside. The sterile smell of disinfectant hit me like a wall, and the fluorescent lights felt too bright. As I approached the front desk, Ben Miller, I said, my voice shaking. Where is he? The nurse looked up, her face softening when she saw the panic in my eyes. Room 312, third floor, she said. Take the elevator to the right. Richard caught up to me as I sprinted toward the elevator, his hand on my shoulder, a grounding force as I fought to keep my emotions in check. When we reached the third floor, I saw Josh pacing outside the room. He rushed over when he spotted me, his face pale and drawn. He's stable now, he said quickly, as if he knew that was the first thing I needed to hear. But it was close. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. What happened? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Josh hesitated, glancing at Richard before answering. He was in a car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit him head-on. The words felt like a punch to the gut, and I had to steady myself against the wall. Is he awake? I asked, desperate to see him. Josh nodded. Go. He's been asking for you. Richard stayed behind as I entered the room, giving me a moment alone with Ben. Seeing him lying there, hooked up to monitors, with a bandage wrapped around his head, broke something inside me. Ben, I said softly, sitting beside his bed, his eyes fluttered open, and a weak smile spread across his face. Hey, Alex, he murmured, his voice hoarse. You came. Of course I came, I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. You scared the hell out of me. He chuckled weakly, his laugh turning into a wince of pain. Sorry about that, he said, his tone light despite the situation. Guess I've still got some bad luck to burn through. We talked for a while, and I could see his strength returning with every passing minute. He told me about the accident, about how the paramedics said he was lucky to be alive. As I sat there holding his hand, I realized just how fragile life could be. Everything could change in an instant, and I didn't want to waste another second pretending I didn't care about the things or people that mattered to me. When I left the room, Richard was waiting for me in the hallway. He stood as I approached, his expression unreadable. How is he? He asked. He'll be okay, I said, my voice steady for the first time that night. Richard nodded, relief flashing across his face. I'm glad, he said simply. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge what I felt. He wasn't just some rich man who'd stepped into my life by chance. He was someone who cared, who showed up when it mattered, and who made me feel like I wasn't alone. Thank you, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Richard's brow furrowed. For what? He asked. For being here, I replied. For me. He didn't say anything, but the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing that mattered, said more than words ever could. But just as I thought I could finally let my guard down, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen, my heart sinking when I saw the name, Daniel. What could he possibly want now? The name on my phone screen made my stomach twist. Daniel? I hesitated, unsure whether to answer, but Richard noticed my reaction immediately. It's him, isn't it? He asked, his voice quiet but tense. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. What could he possibly want now? I whispered, the anxiety in my voice unmistakable. Richard's expression hardened, his usual calm replaced by a sharp edge. Answer it, he said. Let's find out. I reluctantly swiped to accept the call, pressing the phone to my ear. Hello. My voice was shaky, and Daniel wasted no time getting to the point. Meet me at the bistro on 5th, he said, his tone clipped. We need to talk. Before I could respond, he hung up, leaving me staring at the phone in disbelief. Richard was watching me closely, his jaw tight. What did he say? He asked. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. He wants to meet. I don't know why, but I trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. Richard stepped closer, his presence steadying me. You don't have to go, he said. Whatever he wants, it can wait. But I shook my head, knowing that wasn't true. I need to do this, I said, my voice firmer now. I need to know what he wants. Richard's eyes searched mine, and after a moment, he nodded. Then I'm coming with you. The bistro on 5th was quiet when we arrived, the dim lighting casting shadows across the room. Daniel was already there, sitting at a corner table with a drink in hand. He didn't look surprised to see Richard with me, though his expression was anything but friendly. Richard, he said, his voice cold. I should have known you'd come. Richard ignored the jab, pulling out a chair for me before sitting down himself. What do you want, Daniel? He asked, his tone sharp. Daniel smirked, leaning back in his chair. Relax, he said, swirling the liquid in his glass. I'm not here to start a fight. I'm here to give Alex some advice. I frowned. glancing between them. Advice about what? I asked, my patience wearing thin. Daniel's gaze settled on me, his expression serious now. About Richard, he said slyly. You think you know him, but you don't. He has a history of, let's just say, getting too attached. And when things don't go his way, people get hurt. Richard's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly, his face a mask of anger. That's enough, Daniel, he snapped. This has nothing to do with you. Daniel stood as well, his smirk returning. Oh, but it does, he said, because I've seen this before. You think you're different, Alex? You're not. He's just using you to fill the void. And when he's done, you'll be left picking up the pieces. His words stung, not because I believed him, but because they echoed the doubts I tried so hard to push aside. Richard's fists clenched at his sides. But before he could respond, I stood, my voice cutting through the tension. Stop, I said, my tone firm. I don't know what history you two have, but this isn't about you, Daniel. It's about me, and I can make my own decisions. Daniel's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He opened his mouth to argue, but I held up a hand to stop him. I don't need your warnings, I continued, because I know what I'm getting into. And whatever happens, that's my choice. Richard's gaze softened, his anger melting away as he looked at me. Daniel, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to say more, but he stopped himself, letting out a frustrated sigh instead. Fine, he said, grabbing his drink and downing the rest in one gulp. But don't say I didn't warn you. He left without another word, leaving Richard and me alone at the table. The silence between us was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice low. I'm sorry, he said, for everything, for Daniel, for the way this all started, for making you doubt me. I shook my head, reaching out to take his hand. You don't have to apologize, I said. I chose this. I chose you, and I'm not going to let anyone take that away from me. Richard's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw vulnerability in him that mirrored my own. Alex, he said softly, I don't deserve you. I smiled, squeezing his hand. Maybe not, I said, my voice light, but you've got me anyway. As we left the bistro, walking hand in hand into the night, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there were still questions to answer, challenges to face, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid, because I wasn't walking it alone. As we left the bistro, walking hand in hand into the night, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there were still questions to answer, challenges to face, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid, because I wasn't walking it alone. Love isn't always easy, but it's worth the risk. Alex's story shows us the power of connection and courage in the face of uncertainty. What would you do if love knocked on your door unexpectedly? If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to join us for more unforgettable journeys. Don't miss the next one. We'll see you there.